Okay, hello everyone. Today we have the pleasure to interview Professor Simon Taylor Robinson, who was a consultant hepatologist at the St. Mary Hospital in London and also professor of translational medicine and clinical dean at the Faculty of Medicine at the Imperial College in London. So I was reading about your academic affiliation at the Imperial College, and I was very interested to see that you were affiliated at the Center for Translational Nutrition and Food Research, Department of Electrical and Electronic Engineering, at the Center for African Research and Engagement. So I was wondering, how would you combine all these different activities and scientific interests, like being a pathologist, professor of medicine, and also being affiliated at the Department of Engineering, Food Research, and African Research?
That's a good question. I was once advised when I was a junior doctor to focus. And fortunately or unfortunately, I decided to ignore that advice because I've always been a bit of a sort of mental magpie, being attracted to questions that needed answering. And it really didn't matter what domain I was in, because although I might be defined as a hepatologist, or I might be defined as a scientist, or I might be defined as a researcher or a clinician, whatever label, I didn't feel like that. I felt that, you know, if there was a truth to uncover, then one should be able to have the freedom and if one has the ability to be able to pursue those questions and answer them. So for some people, that's not necessarily a formula that works, but it certainly seemed to be okay for me in my career because I wasn't stopped by the constraints of perhaps convention.
Yeah, that sounds very good reason. So to have a broad scientific and also professional interest. So, but despite of that, you were this very full and intense professional life in London. At one point, you decided to use your professional competence as a physician and as a scientist for public engagement activities. So, what was the trigger for that?
Well, I think that actually doctors and scientists have a duty to let the public know what is going on, because in fact we shouldn't be doing work for the sake of it, not to be doing science for the sake of it, but actually we have a duty to the communities in which we serve. And I think that it's the right of the public to know what is going on. And it's the right, I think, of the grant-giving bodies who fund research to be able to allow this dissemination. And really speaking, it really has to be a part of our lives to naturally tell the story. Some things work, some things don't.
Yeah, that's always good to involve people, the community, in what science and medicine is doing, basically.
And also, I think with regard to patient groups, if, for example, one is working in a specific area or in a specific disease, then involving patient groups is actually quite important. It not only motivates patients and perhaps even fundraising, but also is a rationale for doing the research for the scientist, for the doctor, and so on. So actually, it's a two-way benefit.
Yeah, I guess so. But is there any of these public engagement activities that you are especially proud of and you would like to share with us?
Oh well, I suppose in this day and age, and currently, there is an area that I am quite proud of. I'm quite proud of the venture, which is not my own venture, and I can't claim any benefit from it for the intellectual thing, but it's something called the Amos Bursary, and this is the brainchild of Baroness Valerie Amos, who was the first black cabinet minister, government minister in the United Kingdom in Tony Blair's government, and she subsequently became Under Secretary General of the United Nations. And she had this idea that she would want to engage young school children, particularly black boys who were underachievers, in scientific sensitization, so that they could actually go, okay, this is something that interests me. Maybe I can go to university. Maybe I can do things. So for the past 10 years or so, we've taken groups of young boys from underprivileged areas in London, largely of ethnic minorities, to go off to Africa and engage in some of our research projects there, mainly in Gambia, Senegal, Nigeria, and in Malawi. And they have taken part and realized that actually their lives in London are not that bad, and that perhaps, they can achieve. So we've actually had people on that scheme who, through that sort of engagement, have gone on to become doctors and lawyers and people in the city, and financiers and so on, all of whom have actually had an involvement at an early stage. And I think doing that has been quite rewarding, because we've been able, through our public engagement, to perhaps mold people's lives in a positive way.
I think so. But what do you think could be a key to get more physicians, scientists, and any other kind of professional be involved in public engagement activities?
Oh, well, I think other countries should follow something that's done in Britain, which is the fact that it's almost compulsory. So, for example, if you have a grant from the Wellcome Trust, for example, then it's a mandatory part of that to have public engagement in science, and equally well from the British Medical Research Council. And our universities get ranked and scored on their public engagement. So actually, there has to be that. So we have open days where, for example, there is engagement, and my university has a good position in central London, in the sense that it's right next to the Science Museum. So it attracts, on the open days, lots of curious people who are interested in the science.
Yeah, sounds good way. So now I was interested, so because as we talked, so you had the chance to work in UK, like an example of a Western country, and also in Africa. So I was interested more on the difference between these two realities. So the first question is, how do you think the relation between a physician and the patient is actually influenced by the cultural difference? Like, did you have the feeling that you could build some kind of empathic relation with your patient in UK, but this was somehow different or just more difficult to establish in Africa or in other contexts?
Yeah, well, there are a number of factors to that. I mean, certainly, I do not believe in a hierarchical sort of situation where the doctor knows best. I think that's a very outdated mode of doctor-patient relationships. It should be a partnership and a journey that you take together with the patient. I've been a patient relatively recently and really didn't like the sort of patronizing attitudes that many of my colleagues had towards me. So why should I be in a situation to put that onto other people? So I think that sort of partnership is extremely important in a doctor-patient relationship. But in Africa, there's been very much more of the traditional doctor knows best, and actually patients do leave all the decision making and all the thought process to the doctor. And that very hierarchical approach is something I find rather uncomfortable. And I would say that they are, many decades behind thought processes, certainly in the UK, and I'm sure across most of Europe.
I see. So the other question is about the health system. So basically, is there anything that Western countries can learn in terms of health system or patient care from your experience in Africa?
Well, that's difficult because often patient care is fragmented in Africa. And many people can't afford healthcare, and I've seen terrible situations. For example, people needing dialysis in major teaching hospitals in West Africa, who were just left to die because they couldn't afford the dialysis. Equally well, people that were post amputation in hospitals, not even being given paracetamol because they couldn't afford the painkillers. So never mind opiates, they couldn't even afford the paracetamol. So there are lots of areas that make it difficult. But what I would say that is interesting in this COVID-19 era is the fact that the Africans were particularly well disposed to isolation policies and to social distancing because of their experience with Ebola, with Lassa fever, and with Marburg, which clearly are a lot more contagious in many ways and a lot more deadly than the COVID-19. That's not to minimize the effects of COVID-19, of course, but more the fact that the death rates, for example, in Ebola were extremely high. So many of these countries learned all about isolation and about hand washing and no touch policies, and were much better prepared in that sense because they are all vigilant for outbreaks of those other viruses, the viral hemorrhagic fevers, which occur in these countries on a regular basis.
Yeah, that's very interesting because actually, yes, we haven't heard much about the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic in Africa, but it's good to know that they are somehow they are facing in a proper way this health emergency.
Yes.
So yeah, that's good to know. And then, so now I would like to talk another aspect of your career. So you were a physician and involved in public engagement activities, but also a scientist. Can you tell us something about your scientific research on liver diseases?
Oh, well, as I said before, I was somebody that really wasn't focused in that sense. So I did a lot of things in a lot of disparate areas. One of the earliest things I think that I was interested in was hepatic encephalopathy, which is obviously the sort of neuropsychological effects that on the brain of liver failure or chronic liver disease. And essentially the brain gets filtered, bathed in unfiltered blood, either because of hepatocellular failure or because of portosystemic shunting. And consequently, there is a change in neurotransmitters and in cerebral function, leading from mild confusion through to deep coma. And I was interested as a younger doctor in looking at that in relatively objective ways. And one of the ways that we did that was through sophisticated MRI techniques, but which seem commonplace now, but at the time, 25 years ago or 30 years ago, these were really cutting edge. And in fact, the magnet that I worked on was the first in a hospital environment in the world, and is now in the Science Museum in in London as a big forerunner to what is seen to be commonplace today. I also used MR spectroscopy, which is, if you like, a development of MRI, looking at the brain's neurochemistry, and I was able to assess the changes in the brain in this condition, but also to look at the effect of treatment. This led on to other brain studies where I was probably one of the first to work out that the hepatitis C virus didn't just affect the liver, but actually there was a lot of depression involved. And we used imaging techniques, we used neuropsychometry, and eventually a post-mortem study to show that the hepatitis C virus didn't just affect the brain, but it infected the brain through its effect on infecting white cells around the body, and that the cells of the monophage, the monocyte macrophage lineage crossed the blood-brain barrier and became activated microglia in the brain, and therefore produced neurosteroids that had a neuroinhibitory effect, and actually was was the first paradigm really showing that viruses really do cause depression, which had been thought about for a long time, but we were really the first people to show that in this context. And although probably hepatitis C will be something that gets consigned to the dustbin of history because of effective treatments around the world. I would say that the legacy there is in the proof of principle that depression isn't just inorganic, that there may well be an organic viral cause for the problem, something which psychologists and psychiatrists, for example, had not appreciated. I've been involved in developments in liver imaging and looking at liver metabolism using imaging, but also biomarker development as well, particularly for hepatocellular cancer in Africa, in West Africa, East Africa, and actually in Egypt, and also looking at worm infections and biomarkers for cholangiocarcinoma in Laos and in Thailand, just to name a few things, but I could go on for a long time, but those are some of the things that I've been involved with.
Yeah, very interesting. And also, yeah, regarding your liver diseases, so have you noticed that the different incidence in liver diseases between European country or Western country and Africa, and if you observe that this difference could be somehow linked to different living condition or lifestyles?
Yeah, I think so. I think that the major problem is the prevalence of hepatitis B in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's important to recognize that although the WHO statistics suggest that there is quite reasonable coverage for childhood vaccination, actually there's an awful lot of vertical transmission because mother to baby transmission, it really requires a birth dose vaccine at birth, or at least in the first 24 hours, and very few babies in Africa get that because they are not usually born in hospitals. So in fact the vaccine becomes ineffective or only partially effective. So there is an awful lot of new infections in Africa despite vaccines, something which hasn't happened in Asia because they've had really quite organized vaccine programs in places like Taiwan and China, for example, with a birth dose vaccine at birth, rather than being delayed for weeks or months or whatever, which is the usual case in sub-Saharan Africa. So there is a great scourge with hepatitis B, and also drugs such as tenofovir, which are free for HIV, are not necessarily free in most African countries for people with hepatitis B, even though the same drug treats both viruses. And I would go around an awful lot of countries and people would say, oh, I wish I had HIV, because then they'd get free treatment, because everybody knows a relative who's died of hepatocellular carcinoma, of liver cancer related to hepatitis B. And this really is not a problem in Europe. Well, certainly not in northern Europe. It's really a disease of newcomers, so I think that that's the main issue, because actually non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is common in sub-Saharan Africa as it is in the West. We might think that there's a huge amount of obesity in Europe, and so there is, but there's an awful lot of NAFLD in sub-Saharan Africa too. So don't be fooled that it doesn't exist. It does. I think the main issue is viral hepatitis and the heavy burden in Africa.
I understand. So actually, as your scientific research gained the benefits from your experience in Africa, like some of the observations that you made over there that translated in some novel ideas or some novel area of investigation for you?
Well, we've had a big program over the past 10 years called the Prolifica program in West Africa, and I'm part of that consortium. It's not a single person's thing, but it was funded by the European Union to look at hepatitis B, the progression of fibrosis and development of liver cancer in several West African countries, from Nigeria through to Senegal. I think that without public engagement, we wouldn't have been able to get the proper involvement of communities, both for testing and for treatment and for looking at the development of liver cancer. But this then allowed us to look at some novel urinary biomarkers for the development of liver cancer. And we've gone a long way, I think, in different populations to validate a series of potential biomarkers that hopefully will be a paradigm that allows dipsticking of the urine to be able to go, well, you've got you're fine, you might have a problem, you've got cancer. So actually, if you go around the villages every 6 months or so and do a urinary dipstick, and that's the sort of hope, and that's sort of been developed in the light of needs of communities, and so it has influenced both the direction of our research and the way we've taken things forwards, because normally you'd think about blood biomarkers, but urine ones are really culturally acceptable, unlike blood tests in Africa, and are quite simple. But being able to develop urinary tests for liver cancer, for example, hasn't been easy. For a variety of technical reasons, but nevertheless, we hope that this sort of interplay with the communities has allowed us to develop something that is potentially quite useful in the future.
I see. So basically, we have talked about you as a physician, about your scientific work, your public engagement, but you were also involved in many educational and mentorship activities, which is something great, I think. So I would like to know how much training a younger generation of physicians and scientists influenced your professional and personal growth.
Oh, well, I have to say that mentorship is always a two-way thing. You learn from other people and you're not too old to learn. So from that perspective, I've always enjoyed that. And I would say that every day I'm in contact with a whole host of people around the world through social media, usually through WhatsApp or that sort of platform, to be able to talk to them, to be able to discuss, to be able to share scientific papers, to be able to suggest ways that they may go forwards on management. It's been quite useful in sort of COVID era, and so on. So I've learned from them. They learn from me. But I mentor people at an undergraduate level, at a postgraduate level, and even quite senior professorial figures in some countries. So it's all levels, and I think we can learn at every level, and I've benefited from that. And whether that's a senior professor in Uganda or whether it's a medical student in Bangladesh, I enjoy it. Yes, and I think that with modern technology, one is able to have a decent interplay with everybody. And I would say that I do that for a couple of hours a day, and hopefully people enjoy it too.
I think so. So the last question. So what do you feel to tell to a young medical student at the beginning of their path to become a physician, for fully enjoy and have a successful career?
Well, I think clearly you have to like people, because people who do not like people do not make good doctors. That's number one. And you have to learn to listen to your patients, because often patients make important observations that, if we have a blinkered viewpoint, do not allow scientific inquiry. So, for example, I listen to my patients with hepatitis C and realized that they were all complaining of depression and brain fog and so on. And I had to think, well, why are they all miserable and people with hepatitis B aren't, despite the same amount of liver inflammation? Well, of course, it was because the virus was infecting the brain. But of course, you have to think outside the box, not challenging dogma. You have to challenge dogma in the sense that don't accept things at face value. Always think why, and always think how, if there is a why, how you can answer it. And I think that that's the most important thing. Have an inquiring mind, be open to your patients, and think laterally.
Yeah, sounds reasonable. So these were all the questions I had for you. Thank you very much for your time today. I'm sure all of us learned a lot, and it was very interesting to know about your career between science, medicine, and your patient in the UK and Africa. It was very, very, very enlightening. Thank you very much again for your time today.
Thank you.